With how much people complain about Broadway having this kind of show tune quality, there is a lot of difference between music. You know what I'm saying? Oh, hey! I didn't see you there. Since this is a podcast, but not just any podcast. You see, it's time to sit down and put in those earbuds so as not to disturb the neighbors, because this is Off Book, a podcast about Broadway, movies, TV shows, and so many other nerdy things. I'm your host, Marc Stoufer III, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the scores of Broadway, and how even though they all may have a similar Broadway sound, there are some distinct musical styles. Without further ado, let's jump in. Before we talk about individual composers that have unique styles, there are also a lot of broad changes that have kind of continuously shaped and changed what Broadway sounds like. The first of those being history. The musical styles that people have wanted to listen to has changed a lot in the past couple decades. In the 1920s, it was mostly jazz and blues, and so the music of that era was jazz and blues. In the 50s, it started to turn into rock and roll type music. In the 70s, disco was introduced. And then somewhere around the 1990s and into the 2000s, you have this kind of pop music that we're familiar with. And the show tunes of each era kept changing to fit that, because the composers of those shows wanted people to go see those shows, and the best way to do that was to make the music in the show sound like the music they wanted to listen to. That's why a lot of these old-timey musicals have a much more jazzy sound, and that stereotypical show tune sound is a lot of just what people listen to. That if you listen to non-show tune music from that era, it's going to sound very similar. Obviously, show tunes will sound a little bit different because they're written for the stage. There are belting solos and there are big ensemble numbers that you might not find in mainstream music, but style-wise, it's going to sound very similar. Whereas now Broadway doesn't sound so much like that anymore. It now sounds more contemporary, more hip-hop and pop music, because that's what people are listening to outside of the theater. And so the best way to get people to come see the shows, the best way to speak in the language of their audience, is to write the music in that style. So that's a really big reason that music sounds so different. It's because Broadway, most of the time, will sound like whatever people like to listen to. It's just their own kind of version of it that has been adapted to fit the stage and the requirements of the cast and the emotion, because there's so much. Theater is such a heightened version of reality that you're going to have more belting because there's more emotion. You're going to have more people singing because that's what they do in musicals. The other reason is that each show, regardless of the time period that it is being produced in, will often have a lot of its music influenced by the time period that it's set in. There were some shows like Heathers, which never made it to Broadway but played off-Broadway and in the West End. And yes, it's based on the film of the same name. It's set in the 80s, so even though it's a comparatively recent production, the music still had a kind of 80s sound to it, because that's the music that the characters in the show would have been listening to. That's kind of helps to cement you in that time frame. The revival of Oklahoma has a similar situation where it's a modern show, but it's still that old-timey type music. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's a revival and you don't want to change the original music too much. That's how it was written, that's how it'll stay, but also that's the time period. Even Hamilton, which is famous for using hip-hop music to tell the story of the founding of America, and therefore not using the music that would have been popular at the time, it even still has some songs that fit that time frame, like Farmer Refuted, where they use a harpsichord, and they have a very 1700s sounding song. There's also a segment in the show that isn't on the cast album, but if you go see it live, or if you watch the Disney Plus version, there's a kind of an interlude that's played with a snare drum and a flute, which sounds very battlefield type music. So you have those cues in there. A lot of the show's music is going to be influenced by when it's set. It also is going to be influenced by the characters and the subject of the show. There are some shows like In the Heights, which was Lin-Manuel Miranda's first musical, is a lot of Latin-inspired music, and even though it's very show-tuney, it still has those roots there. It has a lot of the instrumentation and the rhythms you would find in that style of music, because In the Heights is all about living in Washington Heights, a neighborhood in New York that's known for being a very diverse place. School of Rock is a lot of rock music, because that's what it's all about. So the characters and the subject matter will have an influence on it. Even the limitations of the show will have an influence on it. Generally speaking, this isn't a rule or anything, but generally speaking, the larger the cast is, the more complicated the instrumentation can be. It's not always, but you're generally not going to find a full orchestra if you have a two-person cast off Broadway. Whereas it's also pretty rare to have just a piano for a full company. It's generally going to be somewhat proportional. So that way the instrumentation sounds as full as the vocals do, and vice versa. You don't want a single piano if there are 50 people on stage. But you also don't want one person on stage being drowned out by an entire orchestra. So like I said, there are a lot of factors that influence the style of a Broadway show in general. That doesn't even have to do with necessarily a single composer or a production company, but really is just trying to play to what people want to hear, what the subject matter dictates, and what the show can handle. Today's episode is sponsored by Timeless Music Incorporated. With how fast what musical style is popular enough to dominate Broadway changes, it's unfortunately almost guaranteed that your show will become outdated musically within a few years, if not sooner. But that all changes with Timeless Music Incorporated. Simply hire a representative, and they'll convert all of your unique, stylized lyrics and turn them into the one musical style that will never go out of style: spoken word. Because when there's no music, audiences can't stop liking the music. So visit a Timeless Music Incorporated storefront today to turn the music that's uniquely your own into music that isn't music at all. And now, more on unique styles. Like I mentioned before, in addition to these overarching factors that help to influence the musical style of a show, individual composers also have a very unique style. And there are a lot of Broadway composers throughout history. A lot of them have unique styles, and I'd be happy to go into detail on more of them. Let me know in the comments below if that's something you'd be into. Today I'm going to be focusing mainly on two: Jason Robert Brown and LinManuel Miranda. Obviously, I have to talk about lin-manuel Miranda. I think I've mentioned him on every single episode of the show. Maybe not literally, but very close. lin-manuel Miranda, please sponsor me. My email is in the description below. Anyway, starting with Jason Robert Brown, he is best known for musicals such as The Last 5 Years and The Bridges of Madison County, and he isn't a super mainstream composer. A lot of his shows are critically rated as mediocre to bad. The Last 5 Years, which is one of his better known shows, didn't even make it to Broadway. It went off Broadway, it has had some regional and some school productions, and it had a movie in 2014, I believe. But it didn't even make it to Broadway. A lot of his shows don't do super well critically, but the audiences really like them. And the audiences really like them because of all the intricacies that his music has. Something that differentiates his music from the music of other composers is that virtually every single song in his shows has some sort of character realization. Music in Broadway shows is typically plot-based. It's a narrative song, and the point of the song is to convey plot. Things happen, and they happen through song. And there's a phrase around the theater community that when a character is emotional, they speak. When they're too emotional for words to encapsulate it, they sing. When they're too emotional for singing to encapsulate it, they sing and they dance, which is why musicals have characters that are so emotional, because that's why the story was chosen, because the song and dance elevates everything to such a higher plane of emotion. And so the plot that is conveyed through the song is driven by emotion, but it is ordinarily much more plot-based, and things are happening and the characters are responding to it, but it isn't so much driven by character realizations. There's a number that's often found in Broadway songs. It's called the 11 o'clock number. This is normally a power ballad near the end of the second act of the show. It's called the 11 o'clock number because it takes place normally around 11 o'clock. And it's the song in which the protagonist really discovers something about themselves. You meet them at the beginning, they go on this journey. Act 1 ends with some sort of cliffhanger. Act 2 opens with a soft kind of, here's a song that doesn't really matter, so you have time to get back to your seats from the bathroom, and then we jump back into the action, and we keep going up until the 11 o'clock number, where everything finally changes for the character, and everything gets wrapped up by the finale. Whether that's good or bad, it can depend on the show, but that is the kind of overall template, if you will, for a show. And what makes the 11 o'clock number work so well, if it's done right, and the reason that so many shows have it, is because it's such a nice way to include a character realization. But Jason Robert Brown's music, whether it's an 11 o'clock number or not, often has those character realizations. His reasoning is that if it doesn't have a character realization, it shouldn't exist in a song. So if you listen to his music, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not, but every character will realize something about themselves or what's going on around them in every single song, which is really impressive, and is one of the reasons that so many people respect him. Another reason that people respect him is that his music is, to the point of almost being a joke, so complicated musically. it's kind of become common knowledge that unless you simplify the sheet music, you cannot audition for a show with a Jason Robert Brown song because the backing is going to be way too complicated for any pianist to play, even with practice. This music is very complicated. It has time signatures and key signatures that are weird. It has rhythms that don't make sense, but it sounds super cool because of how complicated it is and because of how much there is going on. Lyrically, it may not be that complicated, sometimes it is, but musically speaking, there's just so much going on. Speaking of lyrics, he also often references other things, whether it's pop culture or he ties it back into another part of the show. His lyrics are often filled with double and triple meanings that make it really interesting to listen to over and over again. He said before that his musical style is very influenced by Billy Joel and Randy Newman, but he also said that he's very influenced by Sondheim. And if you listen to his music, you get kind of both of those things, where it sounds very contemporary Broadway, but it also has some of those classic musical theater elements to it, and it kind of combines to create this super complicated, super cool sounding piece of music. He's also famous for utilizing styles outside of the production's genre of music when it helps. He'll include styles like Latin or hip-hop or classic golden age ballad if it makes sense for the character and what's going on, as a deliberate break from genre to highlight what's going on in the song. And when used right, that can work super well. So Jason Robert Brown is really known for this kind of very careful, complicated, insightful, and impactful use of music in his productions. Another artist that does a very similar thing is LinManuel Miranda. Now, I'm pretty sure everybody on the face of the earth knows who he is at this point, but if you don't, he's written for Broadway with In the Heights and Hamilton. He's written with Disney for films like Moana. His primary musical genre is hip-hop, and critics and fans agree that he does it pretty well. But he also is very well known for changing styles if need be. He has written ballads, he worked on Moana, which was kind of influenced by this Polynesian style of music. Hamilton, while it did have hip-hop, also had classic show tune music and jazz music and this kind of weird 6/8 style music, and so we included a lot of different styles of music to create this experience where kind of no matter what style you're into, you're going to find at least one song in Hamilton that you like. And that's one of the things that opens his music up for so many people, is that with all the different genres of music that people like, there's typically something that he's written that fits into that genre. He also is very well known for having this lyrical complexity. I mentioned that Jason Robert Brown's music had a lot of musical complexity, whereas the lyrics were kind of normal. And with LinManuel Miranda, the musical style can often be very complicated, but the lyrics are so dense. You've got alliteration and internal rhyming, and every song seems to have a reference back to another song. In Hamilton, he kept reusing phrases but changing them, and he used these very complicated rhyme schemes and multi-syllabic words. He's written the fastest rap on Broadway ever as of this recording. And he has these lines like, I'm past patiently waiting, I'm passionately smashing every expectation, every action is an act of creation. And it's like every single word in that line rhymes with another word in that line. And that's just one line out of the show. And so you have this kind of incredibly dense writing that conveys so much emotion and character development and plot. Somebody actually did the math, and if Hamilton were to be sung at the pace of a traditional musical, it would take somewhere around 5 hours, which is over double the length of the show as is. So you get this really, really dense writing that conveys so much, and it's so complicated, and that makes it really cool to listen to, because every time you listen to it, you hear something else, and you can appreciate something else. He also packs his music full of allusions, references to pop culture. Hamilton was full of them, with references to things like Jason Robert Brown's The Last 5 Years, with Nobody Needs to Know at the end of Say No to This. He's referenced Busta Rhymes, he's referenced Pirates of Penzance, and those three things are very different from each other in and of themselves, and he managed to work all of them into the same show, whether it's through a single line, or a musical cue, or a musical idea, or even a direct reference to a character, not necessarily using a line or a verse or a musical style. But Lin-Manuel Miranda is very obviously well read in music. Well listened, I guess, is the appropriate term. feel like it's not. Anyway, he obviously knows a lot about a lot of different kinds of music, and so he can pack all of his music with these illusions and with these different styles, and he can kind of pinpoint exactly what a song needs to do, and he knows how to do it and how to make it sound good on the first and even on repeat listens, creating this kind of rich experience. So overall, I think that with how much people complain about Broadway having this kind of show tune quality, there is a lot of difference between music. And that's not to say that any of it is wrong. I definitely think that a lot of music gets watered down to go to Broadway because these audiences aren't necessarily going to be well versed in hip hop or in edgy rock music, so they kind of need to meet in the middle where it's not full rock, but it's not full show tunes. So you get, people that like that genre can appreciate it, but people that aren't intimidated by that genre and will still go see the musical. But I think that, even in that watered down form, there's so much room to do whatever the composer wants. And it's often influenced by what kind of music is popular. It's often influenced by what the characters are doing or where it's set or when it's set or the subject matter of the show, by the practical capabilities and limitations of the show. But there's so much room to create an experiment. And I think that that's what makes it so amazing. Broadway's been around for so long, and it seems like every single composer has a slightly different musical style, whether it's through allusions to different things, or different musical styles, different kinds of lyrics, different kinds of music, different influences. Broadway can combine so many different things. Jason Robert Brown was combining Billy Joel and Stephen Sondheim, and those two are very different, and so kind of every composer that works on Broadway has the chance to kind of take all the music they've ever listened to and all the things they've appreciated about music and kind of combine it together to create this blending of so many different things to bridge gaps between musical styles and people that may not even necessarily agree on what is a good musical style. I can disagree on every single thing about music with somebody else, and then we can both enjoy the same musical because there are different elements of different kinds of genres. And I think that the fact that there is so much room to experiment and create something original that no one's ever heard before is really exciting and part of what has kept Broadway alive and flourishing despite all the different changes in popular opinion and just the environment that Broadway is taking place in throughout the hundreds and hundreds of years that it's been around. This episode is now coming to a close, but the closing music will most likely be out of date very soon. Next time, I'll be talking about fan theories and how they impact everything about a Hollywood movie. Have a great Thanksgiving. I'll see you next week.